When it comes to state revenues, they generally come from two main sources. Taxation, usually on the basis of income, wealth, consumption, or tariffs on trade, and the profits of state-owned enterprises. There are historically a couple of other techniques that governments use for bringing in wealth. One of these is printing up money, which ultimately devalues the claims of other people with an existing claim on the monetary base by simply creating more of it. It doesn't enhance the overall wealth of society. It merely redistributes wealth from those who had a monetary claim to the government, who now creates some new money. So people have realized that printing money is not a very effective way of transferring wealth to the state because it ultimately undermines the state's legitimacy to some extent. A second tool that we've largely tried to lean away from is conquest. We've realized ultimately that while conquest occasionally can provide for some gains, the human cost and the economic cost associated with conquest is often something that we're just not reasonably willing to engage in. Many states in the modern world have largely considered conquest as a way of enriching their local population to be problematic. Most countries engage in conquest because they feel they need to for strategic reasons, but the age of broad plunder, where we're simply moving around the world looking for rich countries to invade and take their stuff, seems hopefully to have passed us by a little bit. Now, it's worth noting that the taxation burden can be allocated in several different ways. As I mentioned, it's possible for us to tax income, but income taxes require us to have regular information about the income of both corporations and individuals, which can be really challenging for us. In fact, the first income taxes weren't introduced until centuries after we had seen significant state-based taxes on trade. Income based on taxes simply a informational challenge, quite frankly. It's usually much easier to assess taxes on the basis of things which are easy to count, like people or productive land output. Now, one of the things that became particularly important later on is that when states began to trade with one another, or we began to see the emergence of long-distance trade, one of the things that we see is the beginning of states taxing trade or engaging in tariffs. Now, this can sometimes be a really substantial amount of money depending on the structure of the economy. If a state has leaned heavily into creating trade-based infrastructure, tariffs based on trade can actually be a very, very substantial component of a government's revenue. In fact, in many cases, the tariffs on trade were some of the only verifiable revenues that governments could regularly draw, simply because there was a good system of record keeping at ports to determine who should be the appropriate recipient of goods that arrived by ship. And this documentation created a basis for taxation for us. Now, one of the first times we see a country really leaning heavily into the notion of taxing trade occurs during a period of difficulty during what's often referred to as the Han Dynasty period. Chinese Emperor Wang Meng, who had the usurper of the Middle Han Dynasty, so between about 9 and 23, I believe, the current era, Emperor Wang Mang instituted a 10% tax on business profits and trade, and was fairly certain that they would be able to make up a substantial amount of the state's revenue simply by taxing trade and business activities. Unfortunately, Emperor Wang Meng was assassinated, as usually happens with usurpers, and some of his reforms, including the abolition of slavery, didn't last very long, in particular, mostly because they had brushed up against certain existing power structures without necessarily finding ways to dismantle them. So unfortunately, while he may have had some fairly progressive ideas about how to finance and organize the Chinese state, existing powers ultimately were able to reverse these kinds of shifts in a move that we will later see repeated under the chancellorship of Wang Anshe. But it's important to remember that tax policies, even in the modern world, do have a very major impact on the overall amount of allocation that takes place within a nation's economy. So the burden of taxes is an important policy decision. How should we tax people? On what basis should we tax people? For instance, in one of the areas where we see that people are particularly averse to paying national level taxes is in Italy, where, interestingly enough, land taxes are relatively low, but income taxes are relatively high. When pressed on the structure of this kind of tax basis, which many economists feel is the reverse of what it should be, Italian politicians revealed that there was continuing pressure to keep land taxes low and to otherwise finance the state through income taxes. The natural result of this has been for people to hold most of their wealth in land and for people to evade taxes on income to the extent possible, where taxes are relatively high. So in a country like Italy, which seems to have pervasive and persistent budget deficits, it can be really an issue of simply how we allocate the tax burden, and simply shifting the responsibility for financing the state can alleviate a lot of unusual complications and dislocations that might otherwise occur. Now, when we take a look at the situation of financing the Canadian state in particular, we notice that there is some early pieces of Canadian history that tie exactly to this notion. In 1837, there was a violent rebellion in what was then called Lower Canada, followed by one in Upper Canada the following year. Geographically, we often think of Upper as being the one further north, but on an elevation basis, the Lower Lakes region in southern Ontario was referred to as Upper Canada for elevation purposes, as Quebec and Lower Canada lay beneath it on an elevation basis. So if you were to rain down water at the Great Lakes, it would of course flow downhill to Lower Canada, despite the fact that Lower Canada is north of Upper Canada on the map for the most part. Now, that settled, there was a rebellion in 1837 in Lower Canada, and one of the reasons for this rebellion was ultimately a significant disagreements about how the burgeoning Canadian state ought to be financed. There were, broadly speaking, two political, I wouldn't say parties, but there were two political organizations, or two political factions perhaps, which were disputing about how to finance the necessary infrastructure to develop Canada to enhance its extractive capacities. In Lower Canada, we had what was called the Chateau clique, largely merchants and the political establishment who wanted to tax farmers and land. Meanwhile, the farmers, for the most part, felt that it was more relevant for them for the state to tax imports and sales. And this direct disagreement about who ought to bear the burden of financing the states ultimately led to violent confrontations, both in Lower and in Upper Canada. Now, 30 years after that, once we get to Canadian Confederation, of bringing together the various colonies in British North America to actually form a country, once Canada is established, most of the government revenues, as it turns out, are tariff-based on the basis of trade, and that makes them controlled by the federal authority in Ottawa. The decision to locate the capital in Ottawa, sort of on the border between Lower and Upper Canada, was itself a compromise decision. But we don't see very many changes to taxes until at least a couple of decades later. In the 1880s, Quebec introduces a corporate income tax, and over the next 30 years, the remaining Canadian provinces also follow suit and introducing a corporate income tax. Federal level personal income tax was originally introduced in 1917 as a way of financing World War I, but it was retained afterwards. Now, while a lot of people complain about a cash grab by the country by raising income taxes and then not repealing them when the war is over, these people haven't thought very carefully, I would argue, about the actual burdens of a war. The expenses of a war don't end once there is an armistice signed. The expenses of the war end when the last soldier drawing a disability pension or a support pension has finally died. So when we've got hundreds of thousands of people who fought in World War I, then necessarily the pensions for those soldiers had to continue to be paid afterwards. In addition to that, we had developed a relatively large and robust military bureaucracy, which enabled us to actually participate well in World War II. And therefore, it was essential for us to be able to continue to finance some of these operations, rather than simply returning to a colonial military status that we had had around the turn of the 20th century. Now, it's also worth noting where all of the money goes to. Government expenses in the modern world can broadly be categorized into one of three areas. In early states, they tended to focus on the first two of these, but in the modern day, we tend to have enhanced what we now refer to as the welfare state by increasing government's participation in the transfers of wealth from one party to another. So historically, states generally engaged in consumption, which meant paying for wages to things like bureaucrats and soldiers, maintaining government assets, and spending money on any kind of operational costs that were necessary for the enforcement of laws, the collection of taxes, and military service. Second thing that governments spent money on was largely investment, things like infrastructure, whether these were irrigation systems or road networks, or even financing the development of long-term assets that enhance social stability like theaters. Governments spent their money keeping the wheels on the bus and providing some basis of investment. I was mentioning earlier, though, the modern world has seen a shift towards transfers, which now represents for the most part, the largest portion of most governments' expenditures is simply moving money from one set of taxpayers to another. We see this often being done through public pensions, through unemployment insurance, through various kinds of tax subsidies, and of course through welfare programs. Now, while some of the costs of the state are discretionary from year to year, it's important to note that states, for the most part, face enormous fixed budgets. Most of the money that comes in is already been allocated. There isn't a giant pile of billions of dollars waiting to be allocated every single year. For the most part, we have plans for that money. We have plans of who will contribute it, how it will be collected, and how it will be allocated, as opposed to simply gathering up a big pile of gold to be spent at the monarch's discretion. Now, revenues will tend to fluctuate with the broad state of the economy. It's worth noting because taxation largely is driven by the productivity of the economy. So during economic downturns, taxes may fall. Nonetheless, what we see during these times is often that government expenditures rise with things like unemployment benefits, forming a counter-cyclical expenditure. So it's worth noting that during these particular downturns in the economy is when government finances tend to become particularly stressed. Unable to rely on the natural productivity of their economies, governments are often forced to borrow from the private sector or from private individuals in order to make their budget shortfalls whole. Now, unfortunately, governments are not always able to borrow. We see this in particular, even at the provincial level in Canada, in the case of Alberta in the late 1930s. Alberta had expected that it would always be able to borrow from capital markets, but the depths of the Depression were so particularly pronounced on the Canadian prairies that Alberta actually had to be bailed out by the Canadian federal government at that time. So it's important to recognize that governments are not always able to borrow the money that's needed during particular periods of downturns. And so it is essential that governments make provisions for the bad times when things are going well. And a failure to do so is ultimately a dereliction of their duty.